So I'm Stephen Rippington, Dr. Stephen Rippington at Iconic. I'm a proposal writer primarily, but I work a bit in project delivery as well. I've been doing some work on how we integrate sex and gender dimensions into our projects. So what I thought I'd do today is give an introduction to sex and gender dimensions, equality, diversity and inclusivity in research and innovation. And then we can have a bit of a discussion at the end about the relevance of this to Syntecs. So we'll start by looking at how sex and gender dimensions and equality, diversity and inclusivity are integrated into the Horizon programme. And then we can look at their importance as essential components of doing good science. I'll give some case studies which demonstrate how and why we should consider sex and gender in research design before we go into the specific details of areas where I think we can look at this in the Syntecs project. And then finally, I'm going to outline some ideas for what we could do next. And this is really an open discussion. There's time for discussion at the end. We've got an hour slot. The presentation isn't that long, so we've got plenty of time. I'm more than happy to be interrupted, so if you have any questions that occur to you or any comments as we're going through it, please raise your hand or shout out. I don't mind being interrupted. Okay. Now, first of all, has my slide changed? Can you see the next slide?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so first of all, the importance of sex and gender dimensions in research and innovation is emphasised in the Horizon programme by three things. First of all, there's a requirement for some legal entities like RTOs and universities to have a gender equality plan as an eligibility criteria. There's the default integration of gender dimensions into research and innovation content as an evaluation criteria in the excellence section. And then there's the consideration of gender balance in research teams as a ranking criterion for proposals that score the same. So you can see that it's integrated in different places in the proposal preparation process. It's not just Horizon though. National funding programmes increasingly take into account sex, gender, equality, diversity and inclusivity in eligibility and scoring criteria. So as research and developers, this is something that we increasingly need to be aware of and to be thinking about. So why does it matter so much? At its core, research and innovation is an activity that's done by people, developing products, processes and ideas that make things for other people and solve problems for other people. So I think it's logical that it follows that good research and innovation should consider people's needs and capabilities, as well as the potential impacts of the products and processes that we're developing on those people. And we want to capture as broad a variety of people when we're considering needs and requirements as possible, because these are going to be the people that use our processes and use our products and buy them, hopefully. We have about 8 billion people on planet Earth, which contribute to developing these products and processes, as well as buying and using them every day. Now, we know that we're each unique. We've each got our own way of looking at things, which means that we have a huge variety of people and views and needs and requirements that we need to consider. Now, obviously, this isn't practical if we're trying to design products and processes, so we need to lean on the social sciences for tools that can help us to make sense of the social world and to consider things like sex and gender. So social sciences offer us these tools to aggregate, categorise and group people, providing a framework for making sense of the social world by detecting inherent similarities in groups of people and enabling understanding of the needs, capabilities and requirements of people through an understanding of the way that these different social grouping schemes intersect. Now, sex and gender are just two critical schemes that enable us to classify people so that we can start to understand a group's common needs and requirements, enabling us to design and manufacture better processes and products for everyone. Yep, Sorry, was that a question?
No, sorry.
That's right. Okay. So I've just highlighted here some of the other social grouping systems that we should bear in mind. So whenever we're thinking about sex and gender, we also need to think about how they intersect with these other groups as well. So, for example, attitudes to the gender norms are going to be different depending on where in the world you are. So, culture and geography have an impact as well. Equally, it might be different in different age groups, or different abilities, or in different ethnicities and races. So you can start to see, hopefully, how it's not just simple. We just have to consider sex and gender. We have to consider these other intersecting social groupings as well. So
Stephen, sorry,
before, go ahead.
Stephen. In the last slide, when you have income, this
Yeah.
income is what we receive from
Yes.
this.
So yeah. How well you're remunerated. So, but I suppose your personal economics, I suppose we can consider it. So,
Mhm.
if you're rich or poor or in the middle, like most of us probably,
Okay.
it has an impact.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I'm going to go into some case studies in a bit, but before I do that, I just want to spend a few moments to um, classify what we mean by sex and gender, because they're not the same thing, and they are in some quarters used interchangeably, and I think it's important that we get our nomenclature right and that we're using the right terms. So I've got this slide here that just explains the difference. So sex is a multidimensional biological construct. It's based on anatomy, physiology, genetics, and hormones, and it can apply to a person or an animal. Okay. Different sexes have different anatomical and physiological characteristics that can affect the way that they interact with or are impacted by the physical world. Each sex has typical secondary sex characteristics. For example, human females are typically smaller than human males. They have wider hips though, because they have to deal with childbirth. Whereas human males are typically larger, stronger, and have more facial and body hair than human females. Now, that on the face of it might not seem that important, but when we consider over whole populations, these anatomical, physiological differences, it can influence the way that those groups interact with, for example, products, or the safety of using certain products, because they could be designed for different sizes and different shapes. So that, in a nutshell, is why sex is an important consideration when we're designing things. Gender is a bit more complicated. So it refers to the interrelated, socially constructed characteristics of human, women, and men only. So it doesn't apply to the animal kingdom. It's a purely human construct. And it can be broken down into these four parts: gender identity, gender roles and norms, gender relations, and gender power. So gender identity is about how an individual perceives and presents themselves. So it's coming from the individual. This could, of course, change throughout an individual's life, and it may or may not correspond to society's cultural expectations based on their biological sex. So, for example, you might have a human male who considers themselves to be a woman. That's their gender identity. And that's perhaps not corresponding to the societal norm where we consider that a human male would be a man. So it's that idea of personal gender identity. Then we have gender roles and norms, which are a society's cultural expectations and perceptions about how a person of a certain gender should behave, act, or express themselves. And of course, this, going back to that idea of intersecting social groups, can vary massively depending on where in the world you are and a number of other factors. So society's cultural expectations in Australia are going to be different to South America, to North America, to Europe. It's just that geographical difference alone makes a difference in what we can consider to be society's sort of expectations and norms. Then we have gender relations, which are interpersonal interactions and group dynamics that are shaped by the individual and the societal concepts of gender. So these are embedded in interpersonal relationships, social structures, and larger systems of power, including things like the workplace. So this is really about how the idea of gender identity is an individual thing and gender roles and norms intersect in different places and in different ways. Then we have the concept of gender power, which really describes structures and systems of inequity that are based upon gender and which reproduce, shape and constrain opportunities and experiences for individuals and groups. So these could be, for example, societal expectations or norms that act as barriers to people entering the workplace. I'll come on to the example later, but one of the most commonly discussed, for example, is the underrepresentation of women in STEM subjects. Okay, this is across Europe, regardless of which country you're in. Some countries have better performance than others, but there is this disparity between men and women in STEM subjects and in going on into the sort of sector engineering and research and development. And a lot of that stems from this kind of gender power concept where we have unintentional biases or structures in place that actually don't help equality. So it's about, in this context, it's about us recognizing what those might be and thinking about how we can address them. Okay, so that was a brief description of the difference between sex and gender. What I'm going to do now is go through two case studies that actually demonstrate why it's important to consider these things in research and innovation. So I'll start with this 2003 study, which focuses on biomechanical computational simulation of whiplash injuries. Now, this study built from a simple premise, which is that female vehicle occupants are twice as likely to incur whiplash injuries as male occupants in cars, but no simple explanation had been found for this difference. So the study went on to look at different factors that could be contributing to this disparity between the sexes, including, for example, biomechanical differences between males and females, and also gender factors, such as the fact that women tend to drive smaller cars than men and are more likely to be passengers. So they're sat in a different place in the vehicle, which of course could affect the forces that are acting on them if there's an accident. Now, the study ultimately found that anatomic dissimilarity of the sexes was the principal reason for the higher occurrence of whiplash in females. And the authors postulated that the lack of a full explanation for this disparity previously arose from the fact that there are a multitude of finite element models of the male cervical spine, but very few documented models of the female cervical spine. So they went on to build these finite element models, and they show that you can't just take a male cervical spine model and scale it down for females, using that assumption that females are smaller than males, because the angles involved, the forces that act on them, the scales, all interact in a way that means that biomechanically they operate differently, these two spines. So what this showed is that in order to really understand what's happening to males and females in accidents in cars, we need separate biomechanical models. And the study really is showing that an unintended historical bias in research approach has basically hindered that full exploration of the biomechanics of whiplash injuries and ultimately the development of solutions that are going to make cars safer for everybody traveling in them. So I think it's a really nice example of how completely unintentionally, not considering differences between the sexes in the design of things has an effect on the people that ultimately ended up using them. So we went for many years with females suffering twice the number of whiplash injuries as a result of this design choice, effectively. So this is another interesting example. This is a 2017 study about structured prediction models, so machine learning, effectively. Um, what was happening here is the authors were trying to extract information from images to try and identify men and women, just from images. And what they found was that there was a problematic gender bias in web corpora used to train the machine learning models that was having an effect on what was happening with their algorithm. So the algorithm was trained to identify the gender of people in different images, but what happened when they ran it was that the photographs used in the study showing men in a domestic kitchen were being systematically misidentified as women. Now, they dug into why this was happening and determined that it was because women were being portrayed in cooking contexts 33% more frequently than men in the web corpora used to train the model. So there's a bias in that model that was then being amplified in the machine learning. And I think they amplified up to 68% or something like that, which meant that the algorithm is far more likely to misidentify men as women based on its image analysis. Now, there's an interesting feature of this study in that in some ways it's flawed because it's making a gender normative assumption that a person's physiology, which is at best all you can see from an image, actually defines their gender. We know that from what we discussed earlier that actually someone's physiology is a sexual characteristic, not a gender characteristic. So it's just an added point of interest that even studies looking at sex and gender can be flawed themselves. Nevertheless, it demonstrates the unintended consequences of failing to de-bias data sets for sex and gender when you're doing things like machine learning. So I think an important lesson there. So we talked a bit about the impact of considering sex and gender dimensions in research and innovation and what it can mean for end users. But it's not just about this. There's a lot of work that's gone into considering how sex and gender diversity in the workplace can generate better outcomes as well. Now, McKinsey & Co. Has been monitoring diversity in the workplace for about 10 years, and repeated analysis of company performance versus gender diversity on the management team shows that companies in the top quartile of gender diversity are more likely to outperform their peers financially, which is really interesting. And I think speaks to this next point, perhaps, that there are plenty of studies as well that show that diverse teams also perform better at innovation. I think the common reason that this is that's used to explain this is that a more diverse team captures more diverse viewpoints. They've got different lived experiences, which means that a more diverse team can hopefully understand a problem and develop a more holistic solution by not having tunnel vision, essentially. So the two case studies that I showed earlier highlighted the impact of sex and gender bias on product design, but that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the ways in which sex and gender can impact on research and innovation. So I developed this diagram as just part of my thought process, really, trying to identify how the component features of sex and gender intersect and combine and create this complex web of risk and opportunity around research and innovation that impacts stakeholders differently based on whether those stakeholders are a male, female, or intersex, or whether they consider themselves a woman, a man, or transgender, and also whether they're involved in designing and making something, or whether they're the intended end user. So this touches on things like the physical and chemical safety of the processes and products we're developing. We can consider males and females have different biology, and so chemical safety can be very different depending on whether you're considering a male or a female body. There are policies and regulations that can create potentially barriers around things like chemical safety and physical safety and access to the workplace that are different for males and females. There are things like considering customer needs and customer attitudes, which are going to depend on someone's gender identity, for example, but also on those other intersecting social groupings that we talked about earlier. In terms of how we make things, we already touched on how diverse teams have greater innovation potential. There's a follow through where more diverse teams can be more productive, and so there's this interplay between inclusivity and diversity and productivity in the way that we're actually going about our work every day as well. All of these have an element of considering sex and gender. So what I tried to do in this slide was to try and crystallize these ideas into something that we can start to use to understand how sex and gender is important in what we're doing more specifically. So what I've got here is a very typical generic product or process value chain that goes from the left to the right, and it shows everything from ideation, so having that initial idea for a product or a process, all the way through to it's being made and it's reached the end of its life, and how we're disposing of it. And we can think about sex and gender along this value chain as having effects that come from upstream or downstream. Now, upstream factors relate to how sex and gender influences the way that we design and make things. And then downstream factors relate to how sex and gender influences the way that we might access, use, or dispose of those things. So you can think of the downstream to upstream factors as what it means for your customers and your end users, and the upstream to downstream factors at the top are more about what it means for you and the way that you're going about your work in terms of research and development and manufacturing and making products. So we could run through an example just to show how this works effectively. So I'm going to use that example I mentioned earlier of underrepresentation of women in STEM. This underrepresentation comes from different sources, including cultural norms, which can create a pressure of expectation, for example, that women don't participate in STEM subjects, which can lead to self-fulfilling prophecy, effectively. This can lead to less women taking STEM subjects in school, leading to reduced visibility of women in STEM subjects, leading to reduced access to mentoring and professional networks. We tend to go to people that are like us when we're trying to get mentoring or build a professional network. So if you are a woman trying to enter the workplace and it's a STEM-based sector, and you're not seeing any women there represented, then that's a barrier to entry, effectively. So it's reinforcing the stereotype that women either don't do or can't do STEM subjects, which of course is rubbish, and then propagates this underrepresentation issue. The effect of this is a lack of diversity in the teams that are then performing the relevant fundamental science and research and development, which goes on to have two effects. First of all, the workplace processes are likely to be designed with the safety of standard operators in mind. And if those standard operators are kind of monoculture, if they're all men, for example, then women being underrepresented might not be considered in the design of those processes. So those processes could be less safe or less usable, which further propagates barriers to entering the workplace for those minority groups. The second effect is that the products that we ultimately want to sell will be designed by a less diverse group, which means they're less likely to be designed to be broadly inclusive due to the narrower lived experience of the designers and makers. So essentially we have tunnel vision about what's needed and what's required, and we design to that tunnel vision, and we perhaps forget about the broader applications or the broader needs and requirements of our customers. So this tunnel vision can lead to products or solutions that do not consider all user needs, so are less attractive to a wide customer base, which of course can affect social acceptance of the solution, but also willingness to buy. So what essentially this thought process shows is that failure to consider systemic bias in the way that we design and manufacture things can ultimately harm how easily and how well our products are developed and manufactured and then exploited. So it affects our ability to sell things. Okay, so in summary, the sex and gender dimension cross-cuts all areas of research and innovation. The physiological, anatomical, genetic, and hormonal differences between the sexes can influence the applicability and utility of a product or process. Gender power inequities can influence the diversity, inclusivity, and effectiveness of teams to achieve their goals. And sex and gender differences can affect the acceptance of solutions and our customers' willingness to buy. So that's a kind of summary of the generic things that we need to consider in terms of sex and gender in research and innovation. What I want to do over the next couple of slides is just think about what this might mean now for Syntecs. So this slide is here really to help us understand what we can do next. Now, we're in control of the way that we design and make things and how we communicate and engage with stakeholders. So that's the green arrows on the left. But we need to understand how customers and users want to use our products and processes. So that's something else that we don't have control on how they use it, but we have control on trying to understand that. So what we need to do is find a way to bring these elements together so that we can develop products and processes that are made in an equitable way, that we can communicate that broadly to our customers, to all of them, not just one subset of them. And at the same time, we need to really understand how our customers and users are going to use the products and processes we're making so that we don't unintentionally introduce some barrier to their use. The idea is that ultimately we'll increase our customer base and the applicability of anything that we make or produce in the project by considering those customer and user needs holistically. Now, the proposal itself, I went back, I didn't write the Syntecs proposal, my colleagues did, but I went back and had a look at what they'd put in the proposal in terms of potential issue areas. And they've identified these 4 areas. So first of all, we have human-computer interaction, which I take to mean about the way that we're designing the equipment that we're using in the product, the user interfaces and the user experience, and thinking about that for a diverse workforce. So that's our first challenge in a way is, are we designing the controls of a laser in a way that everybody can use it? Then we've got something that's more directly related to the products we're producing. So this functional surface testing. And there has to be an acknowledgement that functional process designs need to consider differences in product performance experience by different sexes. So, for example, we have, I believe we have a hip implant that we're looking at in the project, and doing some surface texturing on that, which is going to affect how it performs. Now, that whiplash case study earlier on shows that there's a biomechanical difference between men and women, sorry, males and females, that we need to consider in terms of the design of the products. So there's that element as well. Then we have stakeholder mapping and engagement. So this is how we communicate with the stakeholders and the information we try to get from them. And this requires something called norm critical analysis of stakeholder needs and requirements to try and capture a diverse range of views. I can go into what norm critical analysis is in a little bit more detail in a moment, but essentially it's about making sure that we design any engagement and communication activities in a way that we don't exclude any minorities or subsets of our potential customer or stakeholder base. Then there's a social impact analysis, which is part of the project as well. And I think within this, we can make considerations about the chemical and physical safety of the processes we're developing, the products we're making, and also consider some of the social impacts on things like job creation as well, and making sure that in exploiting the product and exploiting the results of the project, that we are not putting in place any barriers unintentionally to participation in the workforce in any of the different parts that we might exploit. So I think these are the areas that we can consider. I said I'd mention some of the tools. We don't have to do this from scratch. That's the good news. There are tools out there that can help us do some of these things. One of them is norm critical analysis, which, as I mentioned, it really questions social norms. It's based on trying to understand the experience of people that are outside social norms, with the goal of addressing the root of the problem. So looking at whether there are systemic biases and then addressing those systemic biases, rather than dealing with issues that are perhaps less systemic than that. The disadvantage of non-critical analysis is that it does just tend to throw up a lot of problems, and if we're going to be effective, what we really want is solutions. And luckily there is a toolkit out there that was developed by Vinova, the Nova toolkit for non-creative innovation, and this is something we don't have to use it, but it's free to download and it's interesting to look through. It provides a strategy to foster socially sustainable societies through innovation, and it essentially is a series of cards, a deck of cards that contain different tactics for looking at design and research and development through alternative design lenses based on the problems that you've identified. So it's an interesting read, and it's something that I think any design team in any sector could usefully use from time to time, just to help them take a step back and think about the stakeholders that they're designing for and the way that they're developing their products and processes. Okay, in terms of next steps and what we're trying to achieve, I think what we have to achieve in the Syntecs project ultimately is a gender equality plan, which outlines the problems that we've identified and the solutions potentially that we could implement to address sex and gender equality. So I think in terms of practical next steps, the first and most logical thing to do would be to identify what's already been done and the specific issues that are relevant to each of the partner organisations in the project. And that's something we can start to discuss in a minute, or we can take offline and do afterwards. I think we can discuss it from a work package perspective as well. Then there's an element of understanding our stakeholders, and I know there's probably some stakeholder engagement going on, but I'd be interested to know what's happened already so far and what the plans are for this for the remainder of the project. And this is, as I mentioned with the norm critical thinking, it's about making sure that any information gathering we're doing is designed in a way that we capture as broad and diverse a group of views and opinions as possible, so that we're not accidentally excluding any minorities. Then we need to document the potential issues and define the potential solutions. We can't do that until we understand what they are. And then one of the ways that perhaps we can keep this at the top of the agenda and keep the conversation going is to just have an agenda item, maybe in work package meetings, where gender dimensions are considered. If something occurs to someone, we could just bring it up at that work package meeting and feed that back in to our list of issues and potentially solutions as well for our gender equality plan. So that's all I have in terms of the presentation. I have one more slide just here to provoke some thought. It's very basic. As I said, we can consider sex and gender dimensions from upstream to downstream and downstream to upstream, essentially how we make things and how people use the things we make. So I thought for the remainder of the discussion time, if anyone's wants to kind of discuss any of these points, we can either write them down in the chat. You can send them to me by email afterwards, or we can just discuss them on the call. I can write them down, and I can try and collate some of the ideas of issues that we might have, and then we can go from there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I can just speak from my side, but yeah, makes sense for me. First of all, very, very great presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Very good talk.
Yeah, any questions? I saw a hand go up then, but don't know if...
That was a round of applause, Steve.
Oh, round of applause.
Yes.
Better. So yeah, I mean, I don't know where we are in Syntecs at the minute in terms of addressing these issues. I know sex and gender dimensions, it's in the proposal, and we put it in the proposal, and it's one of those things that just kind of sits there as something that we know we've got to do, and then suddenly it comes along and we have to produce something. So has any consideration been given so far? Maybe let's just start with the organisations and the partners in the project in terms of what they're already doing. I imagine you've got some big organisations. Some of you probably already have your own gender equality plans.
Let's say maybe I just start. So we built in this project a process monitoring system. Of course, we have, as from our organization, we also have a gender equality plan, but in Syntecs specifics also for our process monitoring system, there's nothing regarding gender equality plan. So there's also, I also don't know if we can do something regarding gender equality using this process monitoring system, because it's like a device that you attach to a laser processing head.
Yeah.
And yeah, for me it's also so in thinking, I'm also thinking about I'm always thinking about ergonomics when you come up with this. So I'm thinking about the machine. Is the machine designed that everyone can use it somehow? Or also, I mean, this whole machine has to be integrated in the production logistics concept. So is this production logistics concept, which may be also a question for Fraunhofer IML, is there something that you can where you can think about making something for gender equality? Yeah, maybe also for the software side. So yeah, I'm always thinking about ergonomics, but maybe that's not all about it, of course.
But it's one of those relevant intersecting considerations, isn't it? Definitely. So let's take that. So your process monitoring device, what does it? How's it controlled? How are these things controlled? Are we talking about a special computer system that you need in order to control the lasers, or is there special software, or is it kind of off the shelf software that already exists?
No, it will have a special software for this process monitoring.
Okay, so the consideration. So what we then need to think about, for taking that idea to start with, is okay, we want the design of this control system to be equitable. So what we need to do is consider how different sexes and how different genders might perceive the experience of using it, how they might control it. It's the things that roll off the top of my head is that, and again, it's a generalization, but females typically have smaller hands than males. So if we're putting buttons that are further apart, it might be comfortable for a male user, but is it comfortable for a female user? And how do we get to a point where we understand that? Do you have operatives or operators, in your organization, and you could go and question and you could ask them, what's comfortable for you, and use that to define the parameters of what this control system needs to look like.
Okay.
And equally, the user experience could be different, and that could be different based on sex and gender. Now, off the top of my head, again, a generalization, but I think colour blindness is more prevalent in males than it is in females. So maybe there's something around the colours that you use in the design of your control system that you might want to consider. Making sure, actually, I mean, this goes beyond sex and gender. You can start to think about disability as well in here. You know, if you're designing something that, could you design a system that someone who's partially blind could use, in theory, and therefore remove a barrier to them entering the workforce and participating as they'd want to? So it goes beyond just sex and gender.
I mean, of course, we could, for example, of course, we can have software where you can, everything can be read out, right?
Yeah.
So I think so that's something that, of course, we can put into the project that can be considered for the future. But I think so also in the Syntecs project, we will not manage it because we are happy if we can design the first prototype software, let's say, of course. But it's cool, so that's something that you can come up with for future activities, for future exploitation activities.
I think that's what we want the gender equality plan to have, is we've identified these potential issues and they need to be addressed.
Yeah.
You're not going to solve every problem in this project. Okay, so straight away there, we've got some ideas around the design. I mean, I suppose one of the other ones I identified was the it's this hip implant that stuck in my mind. I saw this when I was reading the proposal. What are the different products that we're actually making as case studies to demonstrate the technology in the project?
Yeah, so it's a hip implant, it's an injection mold, and it's a vapor chamber for a graphic card.
Okay. So are there, it's the hip implant, obviously there's going to be, there's that biomechanical difference between males and females that we should, I don't know how that could be considered. Who's the kind of owner of the design of that hip implant? I mean, if you've got a user that is someone who's actually ultimately going to make that and implant it into people.
Yeah, so that's the PUI, but I think the PUI is not in this call actually.
Okay, so maybe we can talk to them about how they consider differences between males and females in hip morphology and things like that, and what that means in terms of maybe the different surface texturing or functionality that you need to bring to the product. So there's consideration there, definitely. Okay. What about then the way that we're engaging with stakeholders? So who in the consortium is responsible for the stakeholder engagement at the minute?
So at the moment, so EWF is responsible for the work package that is responsible, that we deal with communication and exploitation, and the part specific of stakeholders is on Iconic side. So Stephen, but we are together doing this kind of communication. So yeah,
okay,
could be important. Or could be interesting to probably to have a little discussion of if we are doing the communication, at least the communication in the correct way.
Yeah.
So probably we can have a parallel meeting or something to understand if we are everyone is on the same page, and if we are doing everything that we can that is fine and suitable. Yeah.
In terms of stakeholder engagement, is there any activity around maybe sending out questionnaires and things like that? If we're doing that sort of thing, then there's definitely some considerations we need to put in place in terms of how we design those questionnaires. And where we distribute them and things like that, because we could accidentally bias our responses by not sending them to the people that we want to answer them.
Yeah, can I use this time to understand one thing? Because we in Syntecs, in training activities, we usually, at least we only schedule one training activity. This is the second, but we will do like a questionnaire for the participants to understand if it was good or not. And actually, can we use this is example on this topic?
Yeah,
Use
why
a
not?
specific questionnaire to
Yeah.
understand. Yeah. Can I share the screen? It's okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So here is the Syntecs training evaluation questionnaire for trainees. So for the audience that usually participate. How we did this? So in terms of questions, first question, gender.
Hmm.
It was like I didn't change nothing, so this is original. Then the age, then the country, type of participants, and several categories, main activity or sector of the organization, level of education, professional background or experience, then the training activity, not relevant, type of course, and satisfaction of the training. And now it's more or less the evaluation of the training itself. But probably the first questions, we should understand if they are, at least these first 6 questions, it makes sense or not.
Yeah, so in terms of non-critical thinking on this, I think there are two things. You can think about the language of the questions you're asking to make sure that you don't ask questions in a way that that have any kind of gender bias in it. I mean, flipping this on its head, I've done a few projects where we've looked at job adverts, for example, and the way that roles are described, and there's a huge amount of bias in just the language we use that actually subconsciously causes people to exclude themselves from answering and even participating. So we can have a look and just don't have to do it live, but we can go through and just think, have we asked a question in a way that might be biasing the answer or encouraging someone not to answer even. So that's the language. And then in terms of the multiple choice options you've given people, are they broad enough, or again, are you potentially encouraging someone, they're going to look down and go, oh, I'm not in one of these groups, therefore I'm not relevant, I'm not going to bother answering it, and they just give up. So it's a balance between that, and then also, obviously you want to have those groupings so that you can analyze the data you're getting in a meaningful way, but it's making sure that we don't group it in a way that excludes anyone.
Yeah, that was probably the reason that at the time we, in the first question, gender, we just put it in an open question and not in specific categories.
I think that's a wise choice. Yeah.
But the other actually are in categories, so we can I can share this with you probably afterwards if you are okay with that, just to understand if the questions are okay or if we can change.
I think that's a good idea, and I think it's an example we could use in the project to show this is what we mean when we say design design of the questionnaires. And so anything like that we're sending out to stakeholders, it's just maybe having that sense check on how we've worded things and the questions we're asking. I think that's a good idea.